How did you get into engineering and production?
Well, I was fortunate in the sense that I went to the National Film and TV School for 2 years, and there I met someone whose boyfriend was in a band being produced by Glyn Johns. Glyn Johns, producer of The Who, John Hyatt, Joan Armatrading, had engineered for the Beatles as well, and was one of the first freelance engineers working at Olympic Studios in Barnes. So I knew his background really well, and I went for an interview with him, very green behind the ears, and he saw something in me, I guess, that he thought, okay, he has the passion to get involved and the patience to learn, and took me on at his home studio, which was in Warnham, which is West Sussex, and it was very unusual in those days to have a home studio, but it was fully equipped, had a lovely Helios console, very old style console, and he worked consistently for about a year, and I assisted him at home. So that was my break, really.
What was he recording onto?
It was 24 track, 2-inch, normally 30 IPS. Sometimes we bring in a Dolby rack as well. All bits of kit that obviously not very familiar nowadays, but at the time it was rocking. It was great. It's a great room, and my introduction to that was excellent because it showed me at the time when technology was changing and changing quite quickly, that he still worked in the same way that he had always worked, which was very hands-on, no automation, one 24-track machine, lots of bouncing around, lots of very fast decisions. And I sat at the back and just absorbed a year's worth of work. And eventually he would, let me, get my hands dirty if you want, and learn how to use the console, which even today was unique. I've never actually worked on another console like his. The design was unique, the way that it operated and the way that the signal path worked were really, really interesting. And if I was going to design a console, I think I'd do it in a very similar kind of way.
Could you put a year on this?
That was probably 85. Yeah, so I worked with him for about a year there, and then he subsequently had other projects coming up. He went off to do a John Hyatt album in the States, and he'd worked a lot in LA, so he decided to go back there. And before he left, he said, "Okay, I'm going to talk to some people and see if I can get you a job elsewhere." So he got me an interview, basically got me the job at the Townhouse in West London, and I was at the Townhouse on and off for about 3-4 months, and then they put me in the Manor Studios, which is in Oxfordshire. But that was a real baptism of fire after having worked with Glyn, and Glyn works in a very studious, full-on, lots of long hours, but very studied kind of way, to the Townhouse, automated consoles, 24-track lock-up machines, 48-track, 2 machines running synchronised, and a whole new range of technology, which revolutionised, console design like this, the SSL, and the very, very beginnings of digital recording, new samplers. And that was an extremely fast learning curve, but great.
Going back to Glyn Johns, did he have any favourite equipment apart from the console?
He had very little outboard equipment, actually. He had one traditional plate reverb, which was excellent. He had a mono AMS delay, an AMS stereo reverb, digital reverb, and he had a couple of analog delay units, space echo, things like that. I remember one day we had he would always be trying equipment, but would always kind of, diss it, and was very kind of old school. But we had a Drama gate delivered, which was the first Drama gate where you could actually EQ the input, so you could decide the frequency that you wanted the gate to open, whereas the previous ones was literally, you'd set the threshold and that was it. And he was blown away by that, I remember.
That's the Drama DS201?
201, yeah. And then we had a filtering gate as well, which arrived a little bit later. But yeah, very, very little outboard gear. It was all down to mics, mic amps, placement of microphones. And
Going back to Glyn Johns, did he have any favourite equipment apart from the console?
Yeah, for the drums, the thing is, I remember it because at the time, to me, it was perfectly normal, because obviously it's the first time I'd been in a professional environment in a studio anyway, although I'd been in studios before that. But he had a very specific setup, and so that when I went to the townhouse, and I was an assistant, obviously, still, I saw all these other people multi-microphoning drums. I thought they were mad. But Glyn basically used 4 or 5 mics on the kit. So, mic 47, another 47 at the side, a Neumann on the snare, but not on the top as in the SM57, kind of weighing at the bottom, but literally at the side. And that was about it. He was intrigued by the newer kinds of drum sounds, funnily enough, coming from the townhouse. I was a big Peter Gabriel fan and still am. And I remember hearing Peter Gabriel 3, engineered by Hugh Padgham, and the Stone Room drum sound, gated. And I played him the album, he'd never heard it. And although he didn't really like the sound of what was going on, he was intrigued as to the technique. And so one day we had a delivery of these big metal sheets to make the drum room a bit more, reverberous, if you want, and naturally, and lots of heavy compression. And we played around a little bit. That was interesting.
How do you divide your time between engineering, producing and mixing?
Well, all three, engineering, producing and mixing, sometimes all mix into the same project. Sometimes I'm called upon to do individually any one of those three. But most of the time my work is as producer. But because I come from an engineering background rather than being a musician player, that kind of background, I like doing my own engineering, because part of what I do and the sound that I like, which is obviously other people like as well, is the fact that I can do it myself. And usually, because I know what I want and I'm going quite well prepared into the studio, it's much quicker. If I delegate and give it to someone else, it's not because they're not very good, but I just, I get frustrated because I want it to happen quickly. And I guess that came from working with Glyn, his background. And then mixing, there's so many different ways to mix a record that it really depends if you're working out of the box, which means if you're working out of the computer and you're using Pro Tools or Logic and it's all in the computer, or you're using a console and it's spread across a console, or on occasion if you're not using the computer, it's on tape, old school style. I get called upon to do that occasionally because people know that that's the background I came from, and if they want a different kind of sounding record, it really depends on the project.
How did you take the next step from being an assistant?
I was persistent, annoyingly persistent, I guess, very ambitious, and also I was fortunate enough to work with some really, really great engineers, producers, and I went to the Manor. When I was at the Manor, because I was in-house assistant, I'd had some experience in the SSL at Townhouse, but of course you don't really have much time. So there, on projects, I was given free rein, and so I practiced, and then when projects came in, I was quick, and because I knew the room and I knew the console and knew where everything was. So engineers who weren't that familiar with the room, they kind of let me get on with it, really, to a point of where they went, okay, right, now I kind of take over. And that demarcation line between me setting things up and then me actually, making decisions on my own on a session, would become less and less, to the point of where people would come in and they'd use me as assistant and as engineer. But it came from working with good people. And then when I left the Manor, I actually went on tour for 2 years. I met a band and they were going on tour to the States, and so I worked in the States as well. I worked at some great studios in LA, for example, and the Record Plant and A&M and a few places, and just studied how other people did it, really. So that when I came back to the UK, I had a job at Air Studios in London, the old Air Studios, which is sadly not there anymore, but was above Topshop in Oxford Circus. And so people like John Kelly would be coming in. I'd be working on John Jacobs, various people who had been through the Air School, and so I was drafted in, and then it's persistence, I think.
In the early days, which artists would you say were the most satisfying to work with?
I guess everyone wants to work with artists that they know, or artists that they want to be involved with because they like their music, or because they've always dreamed of working with certain people. That happened to me on occasion, but I would think there were certain sessions in the early days that would really kind of lit the fire for me, but that was more because of the experience I gained from them rather than the artist that I was working with. I worked with John Ilsley on a solo album at Air, for example, which was a really great experience. I don't think the album itself was really successful, but for me, I think for me, it was great because, again, I'd been working with good people and they kind of let me get on with it. I mixed the first Wedding Present album, which was the first kind of real indie English, pre-Blur, the whole 90s thing. And that was great because, again, I was given completely free hand to do what I wanted. But then the band were very, very controlling about what they wanted to hear. So I kind of get it all up and they go, no, turn the drums down, turn the guitars really loud. But no, there were lots of, different kinds of challenging projects. I did Under Milk Wood, which was a complete re-recording of the Dylan Thomas play, George Martin producing, and the whole thing was recorded on digital 32-track Mitsubishi machines. I was one of the few engineer assistants who kind of really knew the machine well, and so that was a completely different project, but yeah, very challenging.
I've heard there are two ways of making the transition between assistant and full engineer. One would be to get credits, and the other one would be to get management.
Credits, I think, you earn your credits rather than them being given to you just because you happen to be making the tea. Everyone starts making tea. You make good tea, then you get to Wider Patch Bay. Simple as that, really. But Glyn, I had a couple of credits with Glyn. Then naturally, working at the Townhouse, I worked on a project with Hugh Padgham, and that was probably my first assistant. Perhaps my first assistant engineering hybrid credit, although I'd had assisting credits before. Then in LA, a couple of things popping up. But I think people recognise you and want to credit you because of your hard work, not merely because you just happen to be there. And then moving on to engineering credits, people ask you, they find out about you. Even back in the early 90s, budgets were becoming smaller then, so they couldn't afford a separate engineer, so they'd get me in because they knew I was the assistant, but they didn't have to pay an engineer, and therefore I could kind of do both. So that obviously you get assisted, you get credit as assistant engineer or engineer.
And how about management?
I went for a very long time without management. When I came back to the UK, been on tour, got the job at Air. Air had its own internal management for its engineers, and when I went out to do separate projects, or at that time they were changing from having in-house engineers to in-house engineers managed by the studio, that they were persuading clients to come in because you could work with this person or this person. So I guess internally at Air I had management. I went off to work with McCartney because Paul McCartney always used Air staff. George Martin was the head of Air Studios at the time, so that was done through the Air management. But then when I left, I went freelance. I didn't really have management because I didn't need it, because I had offers to go off and do various projects. So, for example, I was working at the Church Studios in North London, then owned by Annie and Dave from the Eurythmics, and that was all word of mouth. People would call you up. Depeche, when I got involved with Depeche, for example, they came to the studio, they wanted to work with someone, they'd heard about me, they said, okay, we'll use Steve. And then through the Depeche kind of period, which was actually quite a long time, really working with one artist, or offshoots, that side projects that the band did, or Alan Wilder produced Nitzer Ebb, so I was involved in that with Alan and Flood, for example. That was all because I was working with them, and they just, whatever they did, I was there. And a few kind of mute projects, because Depeche being signed to mute. And then eventually I was like, well, this is a bit odd, because I'm working with these bands, but I'm not really working with anyone else, which is great. I'm very happy to be working with Depeche. So it kind of dawned on me that actually, well, maybe if I had management, then it would be a good thing to publicise yourself and then be able to work on different projects. So again, through Mute, they'd worked with Stephen Budd. I went to see Stephen Budd, who was in the process of starting up his producer-engineer management company. And I said to him, listen, just finished doing this project for Depeche, kind of want to do other stuff. They're going on tour for 18 months. Basically, this is my phone number, what do you want to do? So I went up to meet him, and he said, well, okay, well, I can't take you on right now, but, in a couple of months, I'm moving offices. And really, 2 or 3 days later, he rang me up and he said, I've got a gig for you. He said, I think you should go off and do this. So that was it. Yeah. And I've been with Steve quite a long time now, probably 12 years.
So that's the advantage. You can go outside of your normal pool of people that you work with.
Well, I think word of mouth gets around about you and your skills and what you're capable of. But then when you're in the studio, you're not really, it's difficult to kind of look forward to your next project when you're busy mixing or you're editing or you're doing whatever you have to be doing. So you do need someone who has their kind of fingers in many pies, and a well-established producer management is one way to do it. You could allow a few producer engineers who use a network to promote themselves rather than just having a management. But it worked for me, and it still works. Although, obviously, your career blossoms and the people you work with, home and abroad, gets bigger. So, of course, you're then spread to a whole different realm of contacts and people who are interested in working with you. So then the management becomes more like a filter system as well. And they say, well, we really think you should do this, or we don't think you should do that. Or, I go to them and say, okay, I've been offered this, I really want to do it, go away and sort it out. It's really good, I think, to be in a position where you can detach yourself financially from the the negotiations, because sometimes budgets, negotiations, points of friction, particularly financial ones, it's best not to be involved in. They always come back and ask my opinion, and of course, but if you've got someone in the middle, it definitely helps.
When you've got a new production job with an artist you haven't worked with before, how do you get started?
Well, I can give you an example of someone I'm going to literally going away at the end of this week to start with. I lived in Italy for 6-7 years. I speak Italian, fortunately, more by luck than design. My German's not too bad, but as far as it goes. Again, from working in Germany and one thing and another. But I'm working with a lady called Laura Pausini. Now, Laura Pausini is not really well known in this country, maybe to the extended Italian population of the UK, but that's about it. But Laura is basically a megastar abroad. She's sold 38 million records over the last 12 years. Is anyone who knows Eros Ramazzotti would know Laura Pausini. South America, North America, she sold Radio City Music Hall, 5 Nights on the Trot. Last year, 2007, she played San Siro. San Siro is the Inter Milan, AC Milan football stadium. Sold it out, 80,000 people. So it's a bit daunting. I've known her for a while, and basically they called me up and said, okay, we've been trying to get together with you for a while. Hasn't happened for various reasons, but we really want you to work on this project. So when I was in Italy working on another project, I went to meet her, and very important, the kind of contact. And before you even press a button or get involved musically, is to find your feet with a personality, whether it be someone famous or not. It's really the same thing. And then she actually has her own studio. So I said, okay, well, before I begin work here, I really want to kind of find out what the studio's about, what the acoustics are like, what the gear's like. Accustom myself to the console, and it's a digital console that I hadn't used before. I've used many digital consoles, but just not that one. And that was it. And it's becoming comfortable, I think, with the personalities. And then that makes the working day and scenario a lot easier.
And the first musical steps, how would that go?
Well, the first musical steps, it really depends on the artist. I mean, with Laura, for example, she has good pre-production. I've heard the demos. I'm going over next week. We're going to have a day basically sitting in a room with a guitar, work out the arrangements, make sure everything's fine. And then I'll be setting the band up, and it'll be very advanced rehearsals, if you want, in the room, and then the recording. That's the way to do it with her. Other projects, Soho Dolls, for example, was very different. It's all electronic, not really any live playing, really, bit of guitar, and that's about it. So it was with them, they asked me to mix a song first. So I did some extra production at home, went in and mixed it. After we did that, they loved that, so it was a case of moving on, doing 2 tracks production-wise from the ground up, and then more mixing and more production work, taking on board their demos and then kind of brushing them up, basically. It really depends on the project. If it's a band, in traditional 4 or 5 piece band, then it would be rehearsals and setting it up so that everyone's very aware of what they're doing before they get into the studio. It just makes people a lot more comfortable, me in particular, so that we know what songs we're doing, we know what order probably we're going to do them in, how it's going to be done, and in that case it helps to use studio well. So for example, if I'm doing drums in London, there would be 1 or 2 places that I would prefer, and Moloko would be one of them.
Do you have a home studio?
Home studio? Well, yeah, I guess so. I've got a monitor and a G5 with Pro Tools in it, and my rack of gear. which is frequently kind of racked up, pulled, taken somewhere else, and then put back together again when I get home. I never really wanted a home studio because I didn't really want to work at home. But for certain projects, it's invaluable because you save so much time, so much money, budget-wise, and you are given as a producer much more freedom to try stuff and to experiment, or to just simply edit, and the band don't get bored or they don't get fed up with what you're doing, and on a project by project basis it's become more and more invaluable. I use it a lot, and I couldn't really make the records that I would want to make if I didn't have the facility now, but I would not really countenance it as my basis of what I wanted to do. I go away, record it somewhere else in a studio, controlled environment, take it home, edit, program, blah blah blah, take it back to the studio again. As I said, that saves time and money.
What equipment do you have in your rack?
Chandler compressors, EQs, AMEC bits and pieces, a couple of Uris. I have TC Electronics digital compressor, finalizer, which is amazing. A couple of mic amps, mostly valve gear, just to make sure that the signal path is as good as I can get it in, and then obviously on the way out again. Pro Tools HD3, a whole series of plugins. I would say pretty much the standard that someone similar to myself would have. You can always go overboard with gear. So it's really being selective and making sure that the equipment that you have you use and you get the most out of it, rather than it just sitting in a rack and looking good. There's no point.
How do you go about choosing a studio?
Word of mouth, experience, and going there first. If I'm going to go anywhere with a band, funnily enough, most good recording studios like this one, or other studios in London or elsewhere, are kitted out pretty much the same. But the environment, the room is the thing. So this is, we're in the yard at Moloko at the moment, so this is pretty much overdubbing mixing. But other studios, they're so varied that it is really important to go there first and have a look around. And also, you don't be afraid to ask someone's opinion. I think a lot of people, they feel that asking, the studio manager's opinion, or even the assistants at the studio, and say, listen, right, I want to do this. Never been there before. What do you think? And you'll get much better feedback that way than, bringing the whole band in and then finding out actually it doesn't really sound that good.
Does it have to have an SSL console?
No. In some cases, preferably not. Some cases, yes. It depends on the type of sound that you want, what equipment you're using, and the sound design that you want to give your piece of work. I think that's the most important thing, because having all the best gear in the world really doesn't mean anything if you don't have an idea and a pretty good understanding with the artist that you're working of where you're going towards. The artist usually will trust you. You'd say, right, okay, we want this, so therefore if you want to do that, we want this kind of equipment. So the bottom line is usually yours, but it's knowing the equipment and then being able to get the best out of it. But the room is incredibly important, I find.
Many studios have closed down recently. We're in one of the Moloko group of studios today. Why is Moloko so successful?
I think Moloko have had their fortune, and they didn't overexpand at the wrong times, and they just kept pounding away. And also because they're good rooms. People trust the assistants, they trust the staff, they trust the maintenance, which is incredibly important, and the infrastructure. And if you're looking for something, you can phone up. Sophie used to run it, or Lucy runs it now, and then or talk to the staff. Say, right, this is my project, this is my budget, this is what I want to do. What do you think? And I think good business relations in studios is vital, really. And they've just got good gear, you know, and it's, as I said before, it's well maintained, which helps.
Once you're in the studio, how long would it typically take to record a song?
Blimey. Well, in theory, if a song's only 4 minutes, it should only take 4.5 minutes, shouldn't it, really? But depends on the project, really does. If it's a band project and it's live, a la Glyn Johns, my early training live setup, then if the band are well rehearsed and they're good musicians and the vocalist is half decent, you're away. Mr. North, who I recorded in New York, we did 2 days, we did 11 songs, everything live, and there were some guitar overdubs put to what we did, and that was amazing. But they're an incredibly good band. We were very well prepared when we went in, so you know it was relatively easy. For them, the vibe was the most important thing, and recreating what they did live. Other stuff, Soho Dolls, for example, or other electronic artists, you know, Depeche or Nitzareb or various people I've worked with. It's a different scenario because you're starting from scratch. You don't have anything. You may have the demos, but the demo's not reflective of where you want to get to. So you may go through lots of different permutations of the song before you get what you want. Amplifier, we went in with a very open mind about the sound and the direction that we were going to go in. And the direction itself was focused once we were in the studio. The band were incredibly well rehearsed, but was it going to be a huge 3-piece band sound, huge drum kit, that kind of thing, loads of guitars, or was it going to be a bit more focused in the sound? And it's difficult to describe really, but it came together because it just felt that that was the right way to do it. So we'd done our big live recording in Lincolnshire at the church, and then we went to a studio in Manchester and took all the stuff from tape, chucked it in Pro Tools and Logic, and did the overdubs there. So the short answer to a long question, or a long answer to a short question, is it really depends on the material and the band.
But just to put a figure on it, could it take 2 days to record a song?
I always say, people say to me, okay, right, recording, you got 11 songs, how long is it going to take? And I would say anything between 2 to 2.5 days a song. Something like that. Given that how good the vocalist is, which is usually one of the things that takes the longest, depending on his approach and obviously your approach as a producer. And obviously the other guys in the band. You know, guitars can take no time at all, or they can take forever. Drums, again, depends on the musician. But yeah, something like that. That doesn't really include mixing. I'd say, now, you're looking at endless editing permutations. So, yeah, 2.5 days, that's pretty much it.
If it was an album project and you were working continuously from beginning to end,
yeah,
how long would that take out of your life to do?
Well, again, it really depends on the artist. I've been involved in records where it's taken me 6 weeks from, not including rehearsals, but from day one in the studio to the end product, the last mix being done in 5-6 weeks, and that's a day off a week included as well. Other projects, The Cure for example, that went on for a long time because there wasn't really a band when I started working with them. There was just Robert and Perry, and then Simon rejoined, and then kind of bolted on band members as they went along. Then they went out on tour, and so that was quite protracted. But that all told was about 2 years. But yeah, Robert came down the stairs one day. I was there as engineer, and Robert was upstairs. We were in a house, big house, country house in Bath, St Catherine's Court, Jane Seymour's house, which Radiohead nicked our idea, and they did our computer there about 2 years later. And he had a bedroom above where the control room was, and so drummers would come along, and I'd play them the demos, which didn't have any drums on. And they go, okay, well, kind of what am I supposed to do? So I'd stand out in the middle of the room, I could wave my arms around and go, okay, right, that's basically it. Then they'd play along to the click and the 6-string bass or the acoustic guitar part, and Robert would be upstairs, and then he'd kind of pop up and down. And then one day he came down and he goes, listen, he said, you're doing much more than an engineer is supposed to do, sign this. And the brief is that, okay, you're co-producing the record with me, but you can't do anything else until the record's finished. So I was like, okay. So I didn't realise it was going to go on for 2 years, but yeah, that was great.
You mentioned Pro Tools. Is there anything else you use besides Pro Tools?
Well, I say Pro Tools. Pro Tools can mean a lot of things. Basically, Pro Tools being the software. I use the DigiDesign hardware with Pro Tools software, and my weapon of choice is Logic. Purely, there's nothing wrong with Pro Tools. It works pretty much in exactly the same way as Logic. The DigiDesign hardware has become the standard. So using Logic bolted on to DigiDesign hardware is what I would use. There are lots of other plugins that I would use with it, soft synths, instruments, all kinds of various bits and pieces, but that is it. I find the bugbear of going between different studios is that a lot of studios think, oh, we've got Pro Tools, that's fine. It's not really like that. Every project is particular. Every producer, every programmer works in a particular way, needs different bullets to fire his gun, basically. So I find that, unfortunately, a lot of the time I turn up on day one and the system's not quite right, or things aren't working, or not so much now, but there are a lot of cracked programs around a few years ago which caused an enormous amount of problems. Systems crashing all the time. So on some occasions I go, okay, I can't be bothered, I just bring my own computer with me. Plug the cables in the back. I use the hardware that's in the room, but the computer is mine. And that saves an enormous amount of time. Because it's already set up, it's already there. There's a computer is open to abuse. So that is important as lining up the tape machine used to be. So.
If you had to mention a couple of your favourite plugins, what would they be?
Well, I don't really use that many, I have to say. I think the standard would be Waves. Purely because they don't crash, they work really well linked with either Pro Tools software or Logic software, and they're getting better. I mean, the API set of plugins is really good through Waves. Sonny Oxford stuff is really good. The Filter Factory stuff is really good. The compressor bank all the kind of standards really. I play around with a couple of effects, download a demo every now and again and play around with those and see what they're like. But I end up just going back to the same stuff because, again, it's like a good piece of outboard gear. You know it works, you know what it sounds like. I've yet to be really convinced, though, that a lot of the modelling of plugins is really what it says, because there's nothing like plugging in a proper Focusrite compressor or EQ or an API compressor EQ, and the difference. I mean, open your ears and listen. Yeah.
Do you have any favourite microphones?
Big, fat, and ugly, basically, and old. Are my favourites. Ribbon mics. Again, a choice of standard bits and pieces for drums, but I've been using recently they're made in Latvia, and I've forgotten what they're called, but they're the blue bottle mics. Are really, really good vocals. I have a couple of things myself, but if I'm going to a big studio, again, that's the reason you go there. Why would you take most of your equipment or buy most of the equipment if you're going to be in the studio? It's part of their brief to have what you want.
Could you name some models of vocal mics?
The Violet mic, the Latvian Violet mic, I really like. Neumann 47, the Val 47, but the 47, it really depends on the kind of mic amp you want to use with it. But a good one of those, well maintained, is really second to none. I've used all kinds of things depending on how I'm doing it. Even a 58, handheld. If someone wants to sing through monitors, for me, you can have the best equipment, but it's the inspiration and the deliverance of the performance is still doesn't really matter what it sounds like. If it makes the hair stand up on the back of your head, then no one's really going to worry. Which I find a bit frustrating. I know when I was working in the States, although that was a few years ago with other engineers, I found that they were much more particular about the equipment than whether the guy could sing or not. So that would be a bit annoying. There's a couple of favourites.
One hot topic at the moment is microphone preamplifiers. What do you use?
My favourite, without a doubt, is really expensive, but it sounds incredible, is a Groove Tube. The LE mic amps are incredible. I recorded an artist called Leila Manicherry a couple of years ago, and we had the Purple Audio, I think, that make them. They look like the old Yuri mic amps. I'm pretty sure it's them. We had those. We had really nice Amec gear, some Focusrite stuff. We had a selection of different bits and pieces. So I thought, okay, that's fine. And it just so happened that the local music shop, pro music shop we were working in Germany, they knew I was coming over and they said, oh right, well, we just want you to try this, it's really, really good. And it blew me away. Fantastic. It's got a variable impedance on it, so you can actually use the impedance and the gain structure as its own compressor. With Leila's voice I did need a compressor, but it's an amazing piece of kit, and in fact I'm going to take it with me when my next project, because Lauda's got a really great voice and very clean kind of voice. So, but there are a whole number of different bits of kit. I think if you have the opportunity, try it, depending on the artist and the sound that you want, because it's not always the most expensive piece of kit that gets you the result that you want.
I have to ask about compressors as well.
Compressors, I use a couple of old Neves, which I have. The Chandler materials boxes are really good. The Yuri boxes are really good. I've got an old LA4A which is good on some people, sometimes not, because of the release and the attack. You know, it really depends what you want. I love the Pultec compressor. Sounds great if you want a really tight, very compressed, very attacky sound. The older DBX stuff is really good. I think through experience you approach a project with a sound in mind, and that again is a real fundamental thing. And you realise what you want. So the Chiswick Reach stuff may not be good for a particular artist, but it would be your weapon of choice on something else. It really depends on what kind of sound you want.
Is there any other equipment that would make or break the recording?
Really good. You've already asked me the question, I guess, but I mean, really good mic amps. It doesn't matter what kit you've got, whether it be Pro Tools or whether you're working on an M-Box at home or whatever it is. Your end result is only as good as what you put into it.
Do you think a good microphone preamplifier is capturing the sound as it is, or is it adding to the sound?
Everything adds something to the sound. You listen to a guitar amp, and the air that's moved and the sound of it is very rarely replicated by any single microphone. So I multi-mic amps because each microphone, when added together, gives me a fair representation of the sound of the amp. So the same with the vocal. I wouldn't necessarily multi-mic a vocal, depending on what sound again I wanted, but I do it on occasions. But every mic, every microphone amplifier gives you something. Again, you know, the Groove Tube stuff I think is really good, but it's very clean, gives you a very direct, thrown kind of sound with, let's say, you know, a Neumann 47. But if you were using a 414, AKG 414, and you were using, let's say, you know, the mic amps on the SSL, you get a very flat, not so dynamic, rockier kind of sound, and a throwback to, you know, 10, 15 years ago. Nothing wrong with that. Sting used to do it like that all the time. Nothing wrong with his vocals, but the reason people love his vocals is he's got a great voice. Goes back to what I was saying before. Really.
Technically, how would you go about recording vocals if you were comping? How many takes would you do?
Comping has always been there and will never go away. But I often find that if I'm in rehearsals, then I would find pretty quickly how someone operates, more mentally than performing. I think once you get someone in their mental kind of concentrated zone, the results you'll get are far better than you would if you know, they were distracted by mobile phone calls or, you know, not really focused on what they were doing. But several takes. If the vocalist is of the calibre where they can do it from top to tail, I much prefer that. And then go back and pinpoint bits and pieces. And making a mental note, either mentally or you know, sit down, make some notes, go, okay, right, okay, that chorus is really good. And then go back and concentrate on sections. Then send the vocalist away, usually the best thing. Sit down and listen to it and pick the bits that you like. And hopefully at the end of the day, you've got the result that you want. If not, don't be afraid of asking the vocalist to sing it again. I find that the approach to vocals sometimes it's the last thing that anyone wants to do, but the most important thing. And often I find producers and engineers that I've worked with in the past are kind of afraid of the vocalists because they don't want to annoy them or, set them off in a mood or whatever. But you've got a great mix, you've got a great track. If the vocals suck, it's not going to go anywhere. So I start vocals on my recordings pretty early because it settles people into what they're doing. They get the track round them, they listen to what they're doing, do a guide vocal, whatever. They think it's guide, it's not really, but guide vocal. Keep it to one side, and then work on other things, and then go back to the vocals again. And yeah.
When you're mixing, are you mixing on the SSL or are you mixing inside the computer?
I find that because most of my material ends up in the box somewhere, so as I'm going along, I'm kind of mixing. Because obviously the great thing about the computer is that when you pull up the session, it should be exactly as you left it. It's not like, using one of these and then you've got to kind of remember where the faders were, or you've got to reapproach what you've done. Interestingly, even in the days of analog, I found the couple of the guy I worked with in America, when he'd finish what they were doing, whatever they were doing, he'd record the output of the desk on 2 tracks. And I thought, that's a bit weird, I've never seen anyone do that before. And then of course, when he'd pull the track up again, he'd listen back to the last stage they were at. And so they had a direct comparison. And of course that's easy in the computer, you don't even have to worry about it because obviously where it is where it is. But mixing as I go along, a lot of pre-production at home, so that I know immediately when I turn up on the day I'm supposed to start mixing, I'm not editing, I'm not re-recording something, I'm only mixing.
Is the mix going through the SSL?
Well, yes. I mean, I break it out in, again, depending on the sound I wanted, but sometimes I would have it in groups, so all the drums in 2 tracks because I pre-mixed it in there, or perhaps the drums spread out over 8 channels, and bass drum, snare drum, overheads, toms, ambience if you want, and then submix that, and similarly with the bass and the guitars, depending on what it was. There's so many ways to do it.
When you're mixing, what's the most important thing to get right first?
The recording in the mixing process.
In the mixing.
Yeah, the recording, without a doubt. Mixing's easy if you've got the recording right. I think often, again, a lesson I learnt from working with really good engineers and really bad ones, and really good producers and really bad ones, is that the whole vibe and ease of things and the wheels are really well oiled before you even get to that point, so that when you turn up, you know what you're doing. For example, a few years ago, I did some mixing for Soul Asylum, and they'd obviously recorded in the States, and I was going to mix it there, and they said, okay, right, want you to do these tracks or whatever, and I said, okay, copy the multi-tracks and send them to me. And they were like, well, why wouldn't I do that? I said, well, because I want to listen to it before I get there. It's all very well and good hearing the track, but I want to hear it, So they sent over a copy of the 24 tracks, and I was down in Bath, so I actually went to Real Word for a couple of days, and literally sat there and just listened to it, found out what all the guitar parts were, the vocal tracks, so that I was familiar with it, so that when I went to mix, I'd already done all that. So I walked in, started mixing. Similarly, if I'm going to be mixing something in Pro Tools or Logic, send me the session files before I even begin, so that I'm prepped. I know it sounds obvious, but you believe me, there's so many people who don't do that, who just think they're going to turn up in the morning, it's all going to be fine, and they spend 3/4 of their mix day finding out what's going on. That's the way I do it.
Do you use any bus processing on the mix?
Well, the overall mix, yeah. I mean, usually it would, if it's on an SSL or a Neve or a digital console, it's usually going through some kind of compression, limiting, and EQ. But before it gets to the stereo, I would usually put the drums through something else, submix the drums, either internally in the computer or externally, and with all the instruments really, depending on the kind of sound I'd want. If I was going for a more studied American kind of sound, if you want, then definitely all the guitars would be EQ'd, bussed, compressed, limited, and then submixed back into the console. Before then, again, going through a similar process, stereo-wise, for the overall mix.
And the overall mix, what would you use for that?
Again, same story. Depends what kind of sound I'd want. Weapons of choice would be the Chiswick Reach. I think is great. Massenburg EQs, Masselec sometimes. Very precise, but very good. Digital compression, if I thought it was necessary, or if the sound of what I was going for determined that was the right thing to do. Some of those processes I would have experimented with before I even got to the mix stage, perhaps. But it depends on the artist. Obviously comes in and quite rightly says, I love it, or I don't quite think that's quite right, or I don't really like my voice that way, or can you do this? And that's of course it's understandable. The thing is relating to the artist also, the fact that you may have already experimented with that, and so be prepared to be challenged, but then again don't be so scared of that you're not prepared to stand your ground. But when you're assisting and when you're learning, I think that is such a great time just to sit at the back of the room, drink tea and watch what people do, because you'll never ever get that experience again if you're fortunate enough to even be working in a recording studio, because a lot of people, they get their experience at home in their bedroom or downstairs in their mate's basement, which is great as well, and you don't get to see how other people do it. But when you get the opportunity to, then take it. And if you're producing material on your own, at home, in your bedroom or wherever it may be, and you get someone in to mix it, be prepared again to be challenged by the person who's going to mix it for you, because their reputation is really only as good as the day when they're working with you. Doesn't matter what they've done before. You can respect their opinion, but be prepared to go, well, actually, no, I want a bit of this, I want a bit of that, but then listen to what they have to say. And in the occasions when I've had material mixed for me, for example, that's been interesting and challenging in its own way, but invaluable.
How do you feel about mastering?
It's probably the only process I'd really don't want to know what goes on because I think from rehearsals to going down the pub with the band, or seeing the band play live, talking endlessly about what you're going to be doing before you even get to starting, and then recording it and whatever, I really want to give it to someone else who I trust to go, well, okay, this is what I've done, what do you think? Outside of record company, production manager, management, band, girlfriend, I want to give it to someone and go, right. So I'm fairly studious about who I want to use mastering wise, because I trust their opinion. So I have a great working relationship with Andy Van Dett, who works at Masterdisc in New York, and I can now send him FTP, I can send him stuff, and he can send it back. I can listen to it, the system I know, or on occasion I'll go over there and I'll be there depending on the project, and that's invaluable. I think there's a tendency for people to send it off to some internet site, say they do mastering, and they get it back and they go, oh wow, it's been mastered. I've heard some awful mastering, on the internet. So you really don't know where you're going to get back. Again, don't always be not fooled, but reliant on the fact that some professional mastering studio says, "Oh, we think it's amazing. It must be you. You just don't like it." If you're the client, if you love it or you hate it, then express your opinion. And I'm the same, because I am the client. Unfortunately, I used to use a guy at Abbey Road. Unfortunately, he died recently, a couple of years ago. And Chris was great. I used to, because very old school. Chris Blair was very old school. He's like going to talk to your teacher, but was very adaptable, and I trusted him. So I think a lot of record companies don't realise sometimes how important mastering can be.
Just in the last minute that we've got, does the record label have much input into the sound?
They try to, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a bad way. But if the A&R guy, if you're working for a major, if he's seen something in a band, he has an idea about what he wants. That's usually why he's contacted you, why you decided to go to a certain studio, and the way that you decided to record something. So it's very important to have that communication so that there's no misunderstandings before you start. And then you can kind of take it on board and make it your own baby. But the liaison between yourself and the artist, record company management is really important. And that is a skill that basically you have to learn as you're going along.
Thanks, Steve. That's great.
Okay.